Now we know what needs to be done. The shading on her face needs to come up one value universally, and we have to bring up the darkest values like her hair as well. Let's start with her hair. Do your best to keep the shape of the highlight and give it some texture by lacing in some hair strands. If you look closely, you should be able to see some information in the darkness from the fill light. So try to leave a few mid-tone streaks showing through your 10th value shading to give her hair some texture so it doesn't look flat. Follow the same directions on the right side of her hair as well. Okay, I'll finish the rest of this side of her hair later. I'm going to go back into the shading on the side of her face next. At this stage in the drawing, you should be putting in every detail you notice into the shading. So if you see some stray hairs on her forehead, go ahead and put them in. But still, don't do the loose hair around her head yet, that's last. And notice this area is slightly lighter than the top of the shadow. I'm going to switch to a B-lead to darken the shading on her forehead value. I've switched to a 2B lead to darken her eyebrows some more. Mind the highlights, and on this pass, bring the darks up to 10th value. You can use a 3B lead instead if you prefer. I'm going to darken these lines and areas around her eye as well. Feel free to adjust and darken anything in your drawing that needs it. I'll bring up the value on the shadow side of her face next. I think a 2B is the right lead for this as well. Of course, the shadow on her neck will need to be a value darker too. The cast shadow from her nose is the only tricky area left to work on. Just do your best to darken it without losing the lighter areas from the fill light that we talked about earlier. And this area between the shadows needs to be filled with a slightly darker value as well. And the triangle of light under her eye also needs to be a value darker. I'm going to work on the transition from the shadow to the midtone while I bring up the overall value on her neck. This transition is too light for the 2B, so I'll switch to a B-LED, and the shading on the light side of her neck should come up a value as well. Notice how far back I'm holding my pencil. I want as much control over the pressure as possible. And don't worry about going outside of the line. You can always go back and clean that up with a rubber eraser. And this gradient can be softened into the shading on her chin and cheek a little more. Notice that there's a light gray edge here on the side of her cheek. Do your best to keep that a fraction of a value lighter. Just like the rim light on her chin, it's going to help create the illusion of a roundness to her face. Her shoulder still needs to be a bit darker. And that darkness ends around here. Okay, this is where a liptical shading comes in handy. I want as much control over the pressure as possible. And don't worry about going outside of the line. You can always go back and clean that up with a rubber eraser.
And
to soften the edge of the shadow on her nose and really pay attention to the detail and spread of it. I'm just gently making tiny concentric circles and focusing on the softness of the gradient on the bridge of her nose. If you look closely at her neck, you can see there's a slightly lighter area. An easy way to lighten your shading about a half a value is to gently dab over it with your rubber eraser, and that'll help keep the shading on her neck from looking flat. And as long as you have your eraser out, you might as well finish removing the remaining axis lines. Next, I'll bring the shading on the right side of her hair up to 10th value, starting with the 2B lead. By the way, if you're using wood pencils, make sure they're always sharp for this. It's a little extra work, but you need to have a point on your pencil to get a good hair texture.